In many cities across America, the once celebrated shopping mall has decayed into obsolescence. So what is to come of these multi-million-dollar structures and the developers who want to breathe new life into them? Our guest recently wrote an article about it. Let's welcome back Morris Ellison, partner at Womble Bond Dickinson. Good to have you back.
Good to be back.
You know, it's so sad because I grew up going to the shopping mall, as so many of us did. It was a place to hang out and do all your shopping and eating in one place.
You could do everything at the malls. Just look at the movie from 1984, Back to the Future.
Oh, yeah.
Everything focused originally on the mall. That's where Marty McFly met Professor Brown, because you knew how to get to the mall.
That's right. That's right. But now we have seen things change so drastically. So maybe you can share with us what precipitated the change.
Well, the change has been building for a long time, and it's really consumer preferences. And we've seen how consumer preferences change very rapidly now. And there has been an emphasis in the last 15 years, particularly on e-commerce, which can adapt very, very quickly. Bricks and mortar retail or the malls have a much harder time adapting. And everybody's trying to predict what the consumer is going to want because they're trying to get a piece of the sales.
Right. And just before we started, you were saying that a mall hasn't been built in the last 15 years, which I did not know that. That's very surprising to me.
I think that's about right.
And then you see a lot of malls that are literally decaying because they're just left completely vacant and abandoned.
What I think tells you everything about malls right now is there's even a website devoted to decaying malls called deadmalls.com. And there are lots of stories. And the current estimate is that roughly 20% of the malls in America are dead. And people are trying to figure out what to do with them. And it's really tough because, one, we don't know the consumer preferences, but also the malls and the legal agreements that govern them were designed most of the time about 40 to 50 years ago. And they were great for when they were put in place. But the preferences have changed. I mean, how many, do you think Marty really knew about e-commerce in 1984? You can't predict these things. And you know, the legal agreements that we have to deal with these sorts of things are done in real time. So to give you another example, the malls are generally governed by what are called the REAs, restrictions, easements, and agreements. And the REAs govern the entire mall, and they'll govern things like when you have to open, when you can close, and all sorts of things. And then you have the individual operating agreements with the mall anchors themselves. And those agreements are only between the mall owner and the anchor department store. And the market has changed much in the last 3 years, for instance, with COVID. And these are put in place 30, 40, 50 years ago.
So the language in these agreements, is this just in perpetuity? I mean, is there nothing in there that says, well, listen, should times change, we reserve the right to alter and change sort of the nature of the structure?
Usually they don't. And part of the analysis that one has to go through is predicting the future, as Marty tried to do and as Professor Brown tried to do. And our crystal balls aren't that good. And so one of the places where you'll see this, for instance, in a residential context, is you'll see people who will get involved with condominium associations, and the condominium documents say you can do things, and then they give you certain thresholds like a 2/3 vote or a 3/4 vote to do things, but some of the things require unanimity. And then you get into trouble, and that's what's happened with many of the malls. There are stories all over the country about how malls are just shitting because the anchor stores disagree with what the mall owner wants to do. And for those in the audience who don't realize it, and most people don't, the anchor stores are usually owned by the department stores themselves. The interior of the mall, which the euphemism is, that's the inline stores, those stores are leased by the mall owner. The leases tend to be shorter term, but if a anchor department store went into the mall, they want 40 to 50 years on their agreements. At least they did in 1884. But now what do you do?
Well, I mean, doesn't that hurt them, though, if a bunch of leases go unused, unsigned? All you're left with is an anchor store and no traffic.
And that's where you get into real problems. So, for example, one of the things that people, if you are talking about a mall, all right, in 2023, what's the highest and best use of that property? And most of the time it's not for retail, but all of the agreements say that it has to be used for retail. You can get into, however, situations where, to use the example you used a few moments ago, you're trying to increase the foot traffic. You're trying to increase the number of customers that are coming. And you do that by having a good mix of the inline stores, the ones that are in the mall itself, and the anchor department stores. And they feed off of each other. And where the model, in my opinion, is really breaking right now, is they are increasingly not feeding off of each other. And so the uses change. I mean, you've got a good example over at Citadel Mall, a really good example over there.
And I want to talk about that. We need to take a break right here, but when we come back, let's talk about the Citadel Mall. And I'm curious what developers are going to do with some of these structures as we move into the future, because it's just a bunch of real estate sitting there unused. So let's do that in 2 minutes. We'll be right back. We are back with Morris Ellison, partner at Womble Bond Dickinson. We've been talking about the beloved shopping mall and what's to come of them in the future. And it's just so sad to see how things have changed, but you know, the times do change. But now we're left with all of these structures, including what you just mentioned before the break about the Citadel Mall. And what can we do with these multi-million-dollar buildings to breathe new life into it?
And the answer is that if the mall owners knew the answer, you would have seen the redevelopment a long time ago.
Yeah.
The dead malls are all over the country, but Citadel Mall offers a very instructive example of a productive use of a mall or a former retail space that involves increasing the foot traffic that we were talking about before. So for instance, the mall owner bought the JCPenney site, had a lease agreement in place with MUSC, and now you have people who are using the MUSC facility, and that generates customers for the mall and for the store. So everybody was on the same page with that.
And Sears, if I'm not mistaken, is being currently used as a set for one very popular show on HBO.
We won't mention it.
We won't mention it. I think a lot of our viewers will know. But yes, so that's the way around it. But what about building above it? What if you wanted to use it as a mixed use?
The operating agreements usually say no. And so, for example, the zoning, when you talk about legal restrictions on a mall, people usually just think about the zoning. And zoning usually allows multiple different uses. It's not just retail. But those operating agreements that we talked about, and you can't get copies of them, they are private agreements between the mall owner and the anchor department store. They restrict, for instance, what you can do to the exterior. So if you wanted to build a new apartment complex, most of the time the operating agreement says no. And because you need unanimity with a lot of this, that's hard to get. I mean, try getting unanimity on many decisions in a household. You don't always get it.
Right, exactly. But you say that AI, artificial intelligence, is going to be the wave of the future for the retailers who would once call a mall home are now taking their business elsewhere.
Well, as much as many of us would like to think that we can avoid AI, it's here now.
Yeah.
And what AI or artificial intelligence will allow and does allow retailers to do is it allows them to get insights that we as human beings can't get into where sales are and where they may be. And the expression, this is not an acronym, the expression that gets used a lot is predictive analytics, so that you can predict where things were going. So to give you an example, as far as I know, nobody really predicted COVID, and COVID changed the way retail has worked in a couple of major ways. Sure. One of them is with something called BOPIS, B-O-P-I-S, buy online, pick up in store.
Oh, yes.
And buying online has become pretty commonplace for many of us, but the restrictive covenants at the malls or the shopping centers often restrict the ability of the retailer to set up an online delivery point. Now, 30 years ago, nobody had heard about e-commerce.
Sure.
Now, it's not, theoretically, that difficult to get something like that changed in certain ways. But again, perspectives will be different.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that a perspective is wrong, it just means that it's different.
So fascinating. But the times, they are a-changing.
Oh,
so
yes.
It's going to be really interesting to see within the next three months to the next 5 years, really how our world is going to look so different.
Well, I'll give you another example. Bath and Body Works, which I believe has 3 locations in Charleston. In 2021, Bath and Body Works closed approximately 50 mall locations, and they opened, in rough terms, 100 locations away from the mall.
Right.
In 2022, they did basically the same thing. Now, if you read the literature that's out there on this, they talk about it in terms of saving money, and that's true. But what they're really trying to do is predict where their market's going to be and what their market's going to want. Now, Charleston doesn't have the same level of a problem when it comes to offices, but if you go to the major cities, it's the same kind of issue. Landlords want longer-term leases, and they want to be able to predict what's happening, but you can't always do that.
Goodness, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us. So fascinating. We could talk about this forever. We'll have to bring you back on, continue this conversation. We're back in 2 minutes.